There
Not
you go.
quite that, but that sounds good. Okay. Okay. So welcome to the webinar on towards effective engagement for a low carbon future. This is Kara Shaw, and it's my team of researchers who've been working in BC who are going to be presenting today. I'm going to start out with just a kind of brief overview of what we've been doing, and then Kate Garvey is going to present on the shale gas case, and Chris Ferguson Martin is going to present on Runner River. Lindsay Monk is going to present a little bit about planning frameworks, and then I'll do a bit of a wrap up, and hopefully we'll keep it to about 40 minutes long. So the I just want to check, Stephen, is the control panel showing on your webinar?
Yep.
Okay, is that okay? Or should I get rid of that somewhere?
Oh, no, no, sorry, it's not. Just the PowerPoint screen. Yeah.
Okay, okay, good. Because it's showing on mine and I don't know whether it was showing on yours. Okay, so um, the overarching project that we've been working on has been motivated by the need to transform our energy systems to mitigate against climate change. And yet the reality that when we do try to transform these systems to move towards more low carbon energy infrastructure, we often are encountering significant public opposition. So that need to transform energy systems and the way that transformation is being blocked in part by public resistance led us to ask the question of why is the public so frequently resisting low carbon energy infrastructure, and how can we better manage energy decision making to enable socially resilient and hopefully environmentally sustainable development. So the BC part of this looked at two cases. First of all, the explosion of public resistance to run-of-river hydroelectricity between 2000 and 2010. And second of all, the emergent but still nascent resistance to shale gas development in the northeast of the province. In both cases, we sought to understand what is driving public resistance in order to consider how we can move towards better energy decision making. One key is that what we're going to present today is really going to be focused specifically on understanding public resistance. We've also done a couple of other large slices of research on shale gas. One project extended to assessing whether or not shale gas really is climate friendly, and another towards looking at the governance challenges that managing shale gas actually poses. And then currently, kind of as we're going forward, we're also working with communities who are being affected by shale gas development to help them develop governance institutions that could help remedy some of the problems that are causing resistance. So I'll talk a little bit about that last project at the end, but those first two projects I can speak to in question and answer, but I won't be able to speak to here. So so those are the case studies. In addition to those two case studies on shale gas and run-of-river hydroelectricity, the Pembina Institute has supplemented this with some research into whether better planning frameworks might provide one part of the solution to engaging the public towards more socially resilient decision making. And as I mentioned, Lindsay will touch on that in her excuse me, in her comments later. So as part of the case study development, we worked up a conceptual, all of us, not just the BC folks, and worked up a conceptual framework to try to capture the sources of resistance in a way that would allow for some comparison across cases. So I'll briefly present this framework, and then we'll have, as I mentioned, presentations on each of the cases and some preliminary thoughts on the challenges that they pose. So loosely speaking, this is the kind of basic architecture of the framework that we have developed. There's sort of three general categories of things that are motivating resistance to these forms of technology. And then within each of these categories are a number of characteristics. So if we start, for example, with the character of the technology, that would include things like public understanding of the technology, their familiarity with it, their dread about its impacts or other aspects of it. Excuse me. The impacts of the technology, for example, on the local environment or on carbon emissions or things like that. The scale of it, whether it has a visual presence as it's installed on the environment, and also its capacity. The energy type, what it's being, whether it's heat, electricity, nuclear, renewable, fossil, kind of what the characteristics of the energy are, and its function and service. So, for example, is it meeting local demand? Is it going for export? Is it being used to support industrial development or things like that? So those are all aspects of what we call the character of the technology. The second category would be governance and context, and this would include resistance to the distribution of risks and benefits of the industry. So looking at things like the ownership structure, Is it a public utility, government corporation? Is a local community owner it, and so on. The historical energy politics, including policy frameworks, how these have shaped the public's understanding of and confidence in regulatory processes. The community context, does the community have existence of this kind of energy development, other kinds of energy development in the past or present? Is there leadership in the community that's kind of mobilizing resistance? Is the community benefiting from this development or not? Things like that. And finally, the regulatory framework and management capacity. So those would be things that we would categorize under governance and context. And then the third area would be the character of the engagement. What's the process that was used to try and gain community consent or approval? Was it legally mandated or was it voluntary? What was the scale of engagement? Did they just talk to a few people, everybody who was interested, or just people they wanted to talk to? What was the depth of engagement? What was open for discussion? How did proponents actually respond when they got feedback, negative feedback? Did they actually, change what they were planning on doing? Was the engagement reactive or proactive? And what arenas was it conducted in? So these are kind of as we've identified, the kinds of things that resistance tends to be organized around. So what we're going to do today is look at resistance to the shale gas industry and to run-of-river to say where have we actually seen, which of these categories are mobilized in each of those cases. So where are we seeing resistance across these two cases? So with that, I'll hand it over to Kate Garvey, who's going to talk about shale gas. And then I'm going to have to do a little quick shift of presentation. So bear with me just for a moment here, and we'll get this one up and running. Okay, then I'll hand it over to Kate.
Okay, so as Kara said, I'm speaking about the social responses to shale gas development in northeastern BC. So I conducted my research with Fort Nelson First Nation, whose traditional territories is shown in this image, and their traditional territories contain the Horn River Basin, Liard Basin, and the Cordova Embayment. And these three shale gas reserves actually comprise over 1/3 of all of Canada's shale gas. So I conducted field work, including interviews with lands managers from 4 Treaty 8 First Nations, Fort Nelson First Nation land staff, consultants and community members, industry representatives, and government employees, and then also spent 6 weeks working with the Fort Nelson First Nations Lands Department and conducted some document analysis. So for this presentation, I've taken the comparative framework and applied it to my research on the consultation process between the BC government and Fort Nelson First Nation. So I'll briefly outline some key points for each of these 3 components and then discuss some of the resistance that is emerging and what the implications of that are. So starting with the character of technology. So as you can see, shale gas is being rapidly developed in BC with the hope of gaining access to higher prices in Asian markets through the export of liquefied natural gas. So there'll basically be a 3-fold increase in production over the next decade, and all of that gas will be coming out of Treaty 8 territory in northeastern BC. So with shale gas extraction, it's dispersed across the landscape, which results in industrialization of the entire landscape, and this has 2 implications for Fort Nelson. One is that there is significant habitat fragmentation and degradation from the development of access roads, seismic lines, and pipeline right-of-ways. And also because it's dispersed, the actual scale of individual projects is relatively small, which means that most projects don't trigger an environmental assessment, which allows development to take place really rapidly. So if you look at the grid on this map that Fort Nelson First Nation has provided, you can see that in certain areas of their territory, there's already almost 10 kilometers of linear disturbance per square kilometer. And then if we look closely at the area of Two Island Lake, we can see the impacts in a culturally significant area for Fort Nelson First Nation. And this is an area that they've designated a special management zone in their land use strategy that they've released. So in this image, the yellow dots are the well sites, the blue dots are water withdrawals, the green dots are barrel pits, the orange lines are roads, and the gray lines are seismic lines. And this is also the location of the world's largest fracturing operation that took place in 2010. And over the course of 111 days, 16 wells on a single well pad were fracked 274 times in order to get the wells producing, and that used 980 million liters of water, which was predominantly surface water and which is now forever removed from the hydrologic cycle. So Fort Nelson First Nation is concerned that these impacts are dramatically impacting on their ability to meaningfully practice their treaty rights. And this is a quote from the Fort Nelson lands manager. "I'm worried, well, big picture, the health of the rivers, the muskeg, and the lakes, and the cumulative effects, and our ability to live on our land that still resonates with being Dene. Having access to our village sites, healthy land and water, animals, all that stuff doesn't seem to me to be figuring into the decision-making process." So this just shows some of the concerns that are arising. And if we move into the character of engagement, focusing on the consultation process, which is based on the BC Oil and Gas Commission's regulatory permitting process. What this means is that consultation begins after tenure has been sold to the proponents, and that it's a reactive approach that focuses on a single activity at a time. So for example, one well pad, like the one we were just discussing, could have dozens of permits for different components of the project. For example, one for the access road, one for a frac sand pit, and then individual permits for each of the short-term water withdrawals. So then the Oil and Gas Commission assesses each permit individually to determine whether or not it has the potential to infringe on Fort Nelson First Nations treaty rights. So what this does is it restricts the depth of discussion to site-specific infringements on treaty rights, which creates a fundamental issue of scale, since treaty rights operate at a landscape scale and the permits operate at the point of activity alone. So to help explain this, this is an image of all of the short-term water withdrawals that are currently in operation in Fort Nelson First Nations territory. And Fort Nelson only started beginning to receive referrals for these permits in the fall of 2011. And for each permit, they have only 10 to 20 days to respond. And because these permits are supposed to be short-term, although many of them are being renewed on an annual basis, there is no cumulative impact assessment conducted, and without that sort of monitoring data, Fort Nelson's concerns are often dismissed as anecdotal. So this quote is from the Fort Nelson First Nation Lands Director. "As long as consultation is focused solely on permitting and determining at a micro level that our rights aren't impacted, then there's no way our interests will ever be addressed. It's not the way they do things. They're all looking for excuses to not address our rights." So what this means is that consultation is operating external to the point of decision making. So when a permit is approved by the Oil and Gas Commission, basically the only option for Fort Nelson is to appeal to the industry proponent to make changes to their development plan or to seek legal action. So the key point for this section is basically that legally mandated consultation is occurring, but it's far from adequate. So moving on to governance and context. As I was saying, the consultation process mirrors the permit-by-permit regulatory framework that's currently in place. And what the permit-by-permit process means is that there's no pre-development landscape planning, no baseline studies being conducted, and no cumulative impact assessments being conducted within the sector for shale gas or across sectors, because traditional territories of Treaty 8 First Nations have been undergoing development for the past half century, and they have forestry, mining, and a whole bunch of renewable energy developments as well in their area. So in this context, the Fort Nelson First Nation Lands Department is trying to advance sustainable development that allows their community members to continue to practice treaty rights while also making a living off the land. However, with a decision-making process external to the consultation process, and with a regulatory framework that does not protect the ecological integrity of the region, they're finding this very difficult. And what this is leading to is growing resistance from Treaty 8 First Nations and Fort Nelson First Nation in particular. So Fort Nelson has chosen to initiate a public campaign with a petition that they gathered 30,000 signatures on, and a speaking tour, which resulted in quite substantial national media coverage. And during this campaign, they advanced 5 basic demands that are all related to better management and regulation. So what they're asking for are baseline studies, multi-year pre-development plans, cumulative effects and environmental impact assessment processes. They are asking that culturally significant resources are made off limits, And then an independent body is created for monitoring and enforcement of water withdrawals and gas extraction within their territories. And all of these demands have also been echoed by other groups, including the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and the Pembina Institute. But to date, government and industry have been hesitant to adopt any of these proposals. So if BC continues on its current trajectory, there are a number of implications. For the BC government, their ability to effectively regulate the industry while respecting the social values of British Columbians is being drawn into question. And if they're unable to advance a socially supported shale gas industry, then they're unlikely to be able to create a viable liquefied natural gas export industry on the coast, which will result in a massive loss of predicted revenues. And then for industry with increasing resistance, their social license to operate is decreasing, resulting in increased economic uncertainty, which has implications for their interests in making the investments necessary for LNG to operate. So those are just a few of the implications, and I want to thank Lana and the Lands Department, all the participating Treaty First Nations and interviewees, and Kara, Carbon Management, and photo credit to Matt. And that's it.
Thanks, Kate. I'm just gonna do another little presentation switch, and yeah. Are you still there, Steve?
Yes,
Hello.
I am.
Okay. We just had a moment of shock and a little concern that we were actually once again being cut off. But okay, so that was Kate. And I'm going to now hand it over to Chris, who's going to talk about resistance to run-of-river hydroelectricity in BC.
Great, thanks. So I'll just give you a brief overview of my research and then kind of push it through the framework that we've applied here. Over the last year or so, I've been doing a broad review of independent power producer projects since the late 1980s. That's when they started to pop up. Independent power producers are essentially private projects to differentiate from publicly owned monopolies. Again, it's been a very broad overview since the late 1980s with a focus on the project since the early 2000s up to 2010, and we've looked at specific case studies within that time period. One of the special focuses has been on the 2006 Call for Power in BC with IPP projects. The main source of getting the projects has been through public tender. So with that, I'll move into the framework. So first, looking at the character of the technology and looking at the public understanding of the technology, it's developed over time. Initially, there was very limited concern, largely as a result of kind of the infancy of the technology. It was not particularly well understood, but that didn't translate into widespread concern or dread over not really knowing what was going to happen. Instead, it was kind of a muted indifference, and you didn't see a lot of broad concern. That ramped up over time as people became more aware of the impact. The negative impacts of the technology have kind of been the main trigger for a lot of the resistance to the project. And I've kind of picked out a few of the highlights in BC that I think make it a bit different from other locations throughout the world. The first impact is on fisheries, and BC has a plethora of river systems and fisheries resources that people hold in very, very high regard. There's a huge fisheries industry built around it, and with First Nations in particular, there's a very strong cultural connection. And these projects have a tendency to largely negatively impact fisheries. Similarly, wildlife impacts are often highlighted by those that are concerned. These projects are not as simple as simply dumping a turbine into a river and letting it go. There are very large construction projects that involve building roads and transmission lines and cutting down trees, and it's very invasive to wildlife habitat around there. And somewhere like BC, which is very mountainous and forested and has a very diverse group of wildlife, is significantly impacted. Similarly, forestry is a major source of resistance to a lot of people. In particular, the old growth forest. BC is one of the last places in the world where you can find original old growth forest, and in at least one case, a lot of the resistance came almost exclusively from the proposal to cut down old growth forest to make way for roads and transmission lines. One of the last negative impacts that's often highlighted is the impact to water flow, and this has obviously impact on fisheries, but it also impacts other users of the river, downstream users. A lot of time will become concerned with it, but one of the interesting opponents to these projects from water flow are recreational users, in particular whitewater paddlers. BC has some of the best world-class whitewater paddling, and often you'll see whitewater paddling associations come out very strongly in opposition to run-of-river projects. And it often translates into local concern as well, because a lot of these small remote communities where these are being proposed rely on the tourism dollars that come through the whitewater kayaking and paddling. The positive impacts of the technology have been met pretty mixed. You know, a lot of the impacts around jobs and economic benefits and climate change benefits, they're often acknowledged, but they don't seem to outweigh the negative impact concerns. It is important to note that a lot of the economic benefits that are highlighted by proponents in the projects are very, very important to a lot of Indigenous groups who are often involved in the projects, whether as proponents themselves or as stakeholders. And in that case, the economic benefits of the project seem to be considerably more important than with the general public. So I'll move on to governance and context. A lot of the concern with IPPs and run-of-river in BC has been centered around the history of BC energy politics. And up until the late 1980s, when private run-of-river projects started coming about, the electricity system in BC was operated by a government-owned monopoly, BC Hydro. And in that case, it's kind of a publicly owned system, right? And for the benefit of all British Columbians, and BC Hydro would generate billions of dollars in revenue to go into provincial coffers. And so with the transition towards more privately owned projects, the distribution of risks and benefits became a major concern, where people started likening the privatization of the water systems to kind of a water gold rush. So that's kind of been a constant fuel for resistance, the kind of private concerns. One of the other main concerns has been the limited regulatory capacity. One of the only kind of formal assessment processes is the environmental assessment process, which in itself is often considered quite limited. And one of the main concerns around it is whether or not it actually triggered in a project. And in BC, a run-of-river project has to hit the 50 megawatt threshold in order to require an environmental assessment. And majority of projects are under 50 megawatts. And actually quite a few projects are 49.9 megawatts, with proponents looking at getting around needing to do a formal environmental assessment. And even in the projects where there is an environmental assessment required, it's been mixed. A lot of people consider it kind of a rubber stamp, whereas some other people look at it and see it as a way to really kind of suss out some of the major concerns. A lot of projects have fallen by the wayside because the EA process brought to light concerns around fisheries. One of the last kind of contextual governance-related things has been, as part of this provincial push for it, which really came with a change of government in 2001, was a handful of policies in the mid-2000s that removed local government authority in decision-making, particularly around zoning. And as a result, you got local governments often pushing against the provincial government. Those of you that are familiar with the Ontario case with the Green Energy Act, this was something that the Ontario provincial government pushed through as well, where they removed a lot of the zoning authority from local governments and ended up paying a political price for that. And a similar thing has happened in BC. So it's not just individuals that get upset about projects, but entire local governments. And then looking at the actual character of engagement, the formal required engagement is very limited because the EA process is kind of the only formal requirement for public consultation. There's a handful of very minor other ones, but they occur very rarely. And so when it is triggered, it's often a one-way proponent-driven process, kind of the community meetings and open houses, which are not particularly thorough in their consultation. There has been a lot of informal engagement, though, in these projects, and a lot of the informal engagement has been with First Nations, and that often takes place in the early stages of project development, because as I've kind of seen in a lot of the data, it's very rare for a project to be approved if the local First Nation opposes it. And so within the industry, there seems to be a strong push to get the local First Nations on board. And so you see a lot of projects with either First Nations as proponents themselves and with an equity stake, or getting direct economic benefits from the project. And so a lot of kind of the meaningful engagement for successful projects is very informal and not through the public process. And then similarly, looking at projects in general, is that the successful ones seem to be very proactive in getting public engagement, and vice versa. A lot of projects will get social resistance after the proposal, and then try to kind of step back and try to deal with it. And proponents have a mixture of different ways that they've approached it. Some have simply ignored the social resistance and just tried to beat it out in the approval stage, and others have tried to work with communities, although if it is reactive, it rarely is successful. And just kind of lastly, I'll give some kind of perspective and overview on all of this. In the 2006 Call for Power especially, the actual impact of social resistance was quite limited to the overall success of projects. Only about a third of them were really impacted by social resistance. The other 2/3 either encountered none at all, but quite a few other ones fell by the wayside for miscellaneous failures in economics. A lot of these projects got their contract right before the economic crisis, and so a lot of investment dried up, and you see a lot of projects that just kind of lost all their money before they even had a chance to go in front of the public. And you see current challenges as well, where the provincial government has made a major policy shift in the last year or so towards natural gas, like Kate touched on this big push for exporting liquefied natural gas. And so run-of-river has kind of fallen by the wayside as a policy priority for the government. Also, the social resistance to run-of-river continues to grow. It's now a very provincially wide resistance to it. There's a lot of NGOs involved in it. A lot of political parties have taken stands on it. And it appears as though these government shortcuts have kind of backfired on them, the push to really get these projects approved. is only leading to more social resistance. And then with the industry, a lot of the controversies are catching up with them. We're finding that more and more controversies with individual projects are not coming to light until 7 or 8 years after they've been in operation. And so you see one project where in the mid 2000s it dried up the river for a day and a lot of fish were killed. And it didn't come to light until 2012 that this actually happened. And so that's now translating into even greater opposition to the industry in itself. But with that, I will pass it along to Lindsay.
Just one footnote on that. The newspaper today had an article that 90% of run-of-river power projects have violated regulatory expectations. And it was a memo that the Western Canada Wilderness Committee got their freedom of information, and so 90% have violated it, and the follow-up has been extremely poor on the government's part. So it's just another example of this ongoing stream of newspaper articles highlighting the problems with the approach. But that will turn it over to Lindsay, who's going to talk about planning power.
Okay, hi. So we know we're seeing increased social resistance to energy developments, particularly to renewable energy like run-of-river, as Chris has just talked about, but also to shale gas development in northeastern BC, as explored by Kate. So in response to some of the concerns around electricity development specifically, several environmental groups have come up with recommendations for how the provincial government can undertake some planning processes. So I've here brought together recommendations from the David Suzuki Foundation, Pembina Institute, West Coast Environmental Law, as well as other ENGOs. And I've brought that together with the law reform proposals by the Environmental Law Center here at UVic. How do you? Oh, it's this guy?
Yeah.
Okay. So these recommendations were developed specifically for electricity, but here I'm extending the scope into a set of characteristics that can be looked at for broader energy development planning in BC. So a system of regional energy assessment and planning needs to be created that is linked to provincial energy planning. This would need to do cumulative impact assessment, comparative evaluation of alternatives, including no development where appropriate. It should be done by an impartial agency, and First Nations need to be involved in the design of the process and also as decision makers on a government-to-government basis with the province. The priority should be on conservation and efficiency first. Cumulative impacts, as I mentioned, must be assessed and mitigated as part of the energy planning process. So road and power supply networks, if there are multiple different projects in the same region, projects across sectors. Planning needs to be seen in context of past, present, and possible future developments and assessed proactively on a regional level. Cumulative effects should be focused on valued components of the ecosystem and of human well-being, and the regional planning should be linked to any future project-specific environmental assessments. This planning process also needs to take into account the urgent need to reform water licensing, land leasing decisions, and governance. And finally, monitoring and compliance needs to be conducted. So sorry, I'm having a little bit of a numbering issue there. But planning could be rolled out region by region. So focusing on certain regions first, for example, regions that are likely to see development pressure for energy development or associated development like roads and transmission lines, regions where cumulative effects concerns are likely to be greatest, or where this work can provide timely guidance for infrastructure planning or for community capacity development. And the geographic scope and resource scope should be considered here at an appropriate scale. A sustainability assessment model could be included in legislation. A sustainability assessment will be aimed not at reducing the negative impacts of a project, but at producing environmental decisions that deliver a fair distribution of risks and benefits. So the process must ask, first of all, whether we need the development at all. And if a project does not result in multiple mutually reinforcing benefits, it should not be pursued. So the goal here would be to make BC's energy supply as clean, renewable, and low impact as possible by adopting a renewable planning framework that limits environmental, social, and economic impacts while maximizing public benefit. Regional planning must respect the role of First Nations as decision makers in their territories, and new mechanisms for assessment, planning, and decision making that respect that role should be implemented. Finally, planning must involve robust public participation. So there's a direct role for citizens and NGOs in determining the purpose, scope, and priorities of energy planning. And this should be done in a consistent and transparent way. This process should also include a discussion of how and when exports, for example, of electricity should occur, if at all, as well as ownership structures for energy. Additionally, an energy planning process should consider how it would integrate with existing planning in the province. For example, the land use planning, the LRMPs that are currently in place and covering more than 85% of BC's land base, as well as how to apply such a process to projects that are already underway. So, how important relative to other facets of energy development are planning frameworks to improving public acceptance and support? Pembina recently asked key experts and stakeholders in the renewable energy field about characteristics of a planning process, and their interviewees all indicated that they thought a planning framework is important in achieving higher levels of public support. So the interviewees noted that a planning framework would not be a silver bullet in terms of achieving high levels of support and acceptance, but all the interviewees thought that planning was a key tool in achieving higher levels of support. So specifically, a planning framework could potentially address some of the sticking points surrounding resistance to both run-of-river renewable energy and shale gas. First of all, the need to assess and mitigate cumulative impacts is a priority for a planning process. Second of all, the water licensing and licensing that requires urgent reform could be addressed by a planning process, although the modernization of the Water Act in BC that's occurring right now will impact that. And then also, First Nations rights and title are likewise a priority in the characteristics that I've put forth. It's important to note, however, that shale gas development in northeastern BC is on treaty land as opposed to unceded territory. So any planning framework will have to respect existing treaty rights and obligations, as well as consultation processes, and potentially could include the suggestions being put forth by Treaty 8 Tribal Association in Fort Nelson. Finally, it's important to engage the public in a transparent and consistent way. So a planning process has the potential to overcome a lot of the resistance by including the public as part of the decision-making process. It also has a lot of potential to restore confidence in the government's ability to fairly distribute risk and benefits, and potential to restore the industry's social license to operate. What's important to consider is what the public is being engaged for. Is it merely to inform with the goal of proceeding apace, or is it in order to arrive at better decisions? These considerations are beyond the scope of planning, but planning processes for energy development in the province offer a means to begin to address social resistance to energy development by considering what people are asking for and why. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just say a few words by way of sort of wrapping up and hopefully bringing out bigger messages. As is kind of implicit in what we've been saying, but I want to make explicit now, our sense of the case in BC is that resistance that we're seeing is a consequence of governance failures, fundamentally. And the implication of this is that better engagement by project proponents can only go so far to addressing this problem. When the underlying problem is a political problem, one of a failure of the government to actually enact the kind of precautionary and regulatory frameworks to protect the public interest or make decisions in the public interest, whether this is perceived or in fact, then better proponent engagement isn't necessarily going to actually be able to address that. So we see this as fundamentally a political problem exacerbated by the neoliberal tendencies of both federal and provincial governments at the moment, combined with the kind of general lack of trust in government that, at least in part, is a consequence of neoliberal discourse. So to put it a little bit differently, the public may be behaving irrationally in relationship to climate change, but in our view, they're behaving completely rationally in relationship to the political system in which they live. They have no confidence that decisions are being made in their interest, and so are unwilling to make the sacrifices necessary to realize them. So this creates some fundamental challenges. First of all is the challenge of envisioning and creating institutions that would facilitate effective energy system planning and development. It's not straightforward to see what this would look like. The initial model, or the obvious models that we have, are the ones that Lindsay was referring to, kind of existing frameworks around planning, more or less, like strategic environmental assessments, cumulative environmental impact assessments, and land use planning processes. And these all have strengths, and we'll do a little bit of work, I think, over the next year to think about what each might offer to solving these problems. But if the underlying problem is a wider political one, then probably these can only go so far to addressing that, because the terms of reference for any such project would shape its capacity to respond to these concerns. There are some other contenders that we want to try to pursue further. In particular, we want to look at community-based governance, community-based efforts to try to engage government or structure government engagement to address some of these governance needs. So one will be Matt Murray, one graduate student working on this project, will be working with Fort Nelson First Nations to develop a collaborative water governance model. And Christine Tortoclib will also be working with Fort Nelson to develop a community-based cumulative impact monitoring process. And in both these cases, the fundamental question we're asking is, can a community-led planning and engagement process fill key governance gaps in its context? In other words, if we're moving in the direction of a kind of neoliberal governance model where this stuff is going to be increasingly downloaded and government's going to take less and less responsibility for it, is it possible for communities to fill the gap as one approach? And then another approach would be, obviously, our planning models able to organize public input in such a way that we can get more resilient decision making. So that's kind of where we're headed now. And with that, we'll just say thank you. And if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them now or later.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording because this has been great, and just for now, for the permanent record. Okay. So thanks to Kara, Kate, and Chris, and Lindsay for those great presentations. And we'll see you back at the next BAT station. But I'm going to stop the recording.